After the meeting on August 2, 1941, at the Closerie de Lille, I could not get enough of the good fortune of working with Daniel Casanova, André Leroy and Pierre Georges. The Communist Party leadership appointed me commander of the battalions of youth. I had to find a place to live in Paris, preferably in one of the bourgeois neighbourhoods. They are less watched. These words, spoken by André Leroy, came to mind when I found myself in front of houses in the VID and DCI arrondissements of Paris. At that time, on the walls of houses you could often see ads like this, and furnished apartments and rooms for rent. The prices were bearable. After a long search, I decided to rent a room in the XV arrondissement on the Rue Verreille, in the house number 20. Why here? It is difficult to answer this question. I was guided by many considerations. The room was suitable, though modest. From the platform on the elevator could quickly go to the top, 9th floor, and go to the roof. The window of my room looked out into the courtyard of the neighbouring house. It was possible to climb over the ledge to that house. The house number 20 on Verreille Street was well located. From Aix-en-Provence Boulevard one must turn onto the straight Sivry Street, which is about 200 metres long. As soon as you turn left around the corner at the end of this street, you will come straight to house number 20 on Verreille Street. This location was excellent for detecting surveillance. In the evenings, Sivry Street is deserted. It would not have been easy for the blood dogs of the special brigades of the Paris Police Prefecture to shelter me, as they called it in their jargon, to arrest me. I set myself a firm daily routine and went to work every morning like any other person. I often returned home late in the evening, ate in the Latin Quarter or in a working restaurant on Rue Pierre-Gaurin. Sometimes it happened that I didn't show up at home for days. The gatekeeper and my neighbours saw nothing unusual in this, since officially I was considered a travelling salesman. In the evening, I got off the subway at the Michel-Ange-Autioul station, even though the other two stations were closer to my house. For a long time I had to loop around the neighbourhood, and since then I know almost all the streets of Autioul. During the day I met with comrades in 4 different neighbourhoods of Paris. I saw Pierre Georges and Albert Guesquin almost daily. The latter was recruiting young volunteers in the Paris neighbourhood. I kept in touch with all our inter-district commissioners. Thanks to the active work of Daniel Casanova and André Leroy, there was an increased flow of volunteers who wrote one of the glorious pages in the history of France. We had 9 inter-district associations, and there were also organizations in each inter-district association was active in 5 or 6 departments. At that time, few people in France believed in a happy outcome of the struggle, so it was very important to organize the work in such a way that people were not put in danger. Later, my trips to the provinces to meet with the commissioners appointed to lead our organization of the Frontlines made it necessary to increase the number of meetings in Paris. During the whole period of the occupation, I always endeavoured to keep the number of meetings in Paris and in the field equal. Whenever possible, I always attended the meetings of the inter-district headquarters. At every meeting I had to take into account the possibility of police surveillance. One had to catch the moment so that the carriage door would close as soon as you passed through it. One had to choose a quiet street, linger in front of a shop window or a counter, watching to see if anyone was following you, if there was anyone ahead of you. Of course, the apartment always remained the most important element in conspiracy measures. I often compared it to the trench of a soldier who, in order to get out of his hiding place, certainly does not wait for a shell to arrive. My address was known only to my immediate family, relatives, and a small circle of comrades. I had to be ready at any moment to leave the apartment without leaving any evidence. In the deadly battle we were fighting, any sloppiness could mean signing a death sentence for myself and, even more terrifyingly, for my comrades. Hiring or 2 possibilities for choosing a safe house. Hiring or staying with reliable friends, usually non-communists. In this case, the owners of the apartment were strictly forbidden to do any other work in the resistance. We had very limited financial resources at our disposal. If we look at what the first armed grouplets and then the organization of the French frontiers et partisans existed on, if we take into account the financial means of some of the underground organizations, we can say that we were really poor relatives. We were not in a position to give everything we needed to our underground organizations, and this could not but affect the quality of security. The organizations that depended on London allowed a completely incomprehensible negligence. Their people used the telephone for negotiations, were openly in black market restaurants, did not change their apartments. Lists of members of the organization were kept unreliably. Everyone knew everyone. The arrest of one person led to disaster. Underground organizations like ours observed strict measures of conspiracy. We often had to sacrifice food in order to fulfill our combat tasks. We needed clothing and safe houses, for this was the only way to ensure our safety. Environment, as it is fashionable to say nowadays, also played an important role. A neighborhood, a street, a housing estate could be raided and searched. One had to stay out of them. One had to reckon with the attitude of the gatekeeper, the neighbors, the regulars of the block. Freedom of movement remained vital for a member of the resistance movement. If Cecile Edwidge and I survived the terrible years, we owed it to the constant change of meeting places, to which we travelled by foot or bicycle, and to our 23 safe houses in Paris and its suburbs. If Cecile and I survived, we also owe it to the wonderful people who gave us shelter and refuge, those humble people who are seldom remembered, and they were in as much danger as we were. Without these people, many of us would not have seen the end of Hitler's night, of those who opened the doors of their homes to us. I consider it my duty to name Camille Guillemot and her husband Lucien, a railroad worker from Rue Jean-Georges in Villeneuve-Saint-Georges, the printer Jean Rivière from 10 Carnot Street in Suzy-en-Brie, Gaetana Venot from Cortez, then a teacher in Juvisy, André Tessier, a typist secretary from the Exith arrondissement, the Blanchard couple from the XX arrondissement and their mother, who gave us a furnished house in Villejuif, the Louvre couple from the Exith arrondissement, who gave us a garden house in Champigny, Georges Kiefer, a grocer from Fontenay-Sas-Bois. Alba, a friend of André Tessier, lived in the Exith arrondissement on the Avenue Saint-Mande. Her husband was a highly qualified engineer. She always helped us during those dark years. Henriana Vitterbrot, a teacher and friend of Gaetana Venot, gave us the keys to her cottage in Sight-Jardin near Drevale. Pansier, a merchant from Juigny, my regimental comrade, and Genevieve Petronin from the Exyathai arrondissement gave us their identity cards, by which we rented a lodge and an apartment. Fremio from Pavillon-Saiboit put his country house at our disposal in 1943, where we lived until we rented an apartment. The Carlos couple from Sight-Jardin near Suresnes sheltered us in their large apartment. One of their friends, also an engineer and a resident of Suresnes, did the same. The Laporte couple, who rented an apartment on the Rue de la Pitot, had previously hidden an underground soldier in their apartment. Now they agreed to shelter us, but unfortunately we had to leave on the first evening because we found the approaches to the house suspicious. Our fears were not in vain. A few days later we learned of the arrest of our brave comrades. Let my fellow mechanic from Rue Simplon and many others, whose names I cannot remember, forgive me for this. Let them all know that their names remain in our hearts, for each one of them forms a part of our lives, of Cecile's life, of mine and of our sons. In the battle we fought, one had to be able to make a quick decision. These days, to be wrong about a comrade or anyone else meant only to experience isolated trouble. At that time, it was a matter of life or death. The gatekeeper at number 20 on the Rue Verres, a serious, honest woman, immediately took a liking to us. Her name was Mrs. Seneschal. I tried to avoid long conversations with her. Her husband had been a prisoner of war and now worked as a public transportation clerk in the Paris district. After the victory, I learned that both the gatekeeper and her husband were trusted friends of ours. If the police had questioned her, Mrs. Senecal would have warned me. We had to furnish the rented room. Edwidge and Cecile had given the furniture to friends for safekeeping when they left the department of Nord. In Saint-Julien-de-Leville, on the boulevard de Dijon, Auguste Lignard had a folding bed on which Cecile had slept when she was a girl. I went to him, took the bed by handcart to the station at Troyes, and sent it by baggage to Paris. At the Gare de l'Orient I hired a handcart and thus carried the bed across Paris to the house number 20 in the Rue Verris. Cecile and Edwidge gave me sheets, bedspreads, towels. So I settled into my first command post. Apart from the bed, there was no furniture in the room. Even linen had to be kept in a suitcase or on a newspaper laid out on the floor. And what comfort could we talk about when the country was groaning under the enemy's boot? Apart from the day of my arrival. From August 2 I met daily with Pierre Georges, André Leroy, and occasionally with Danielle Casanova. André Leroy took a personal interest in the state of affairs in the Paris district. while at the same time he was doing a great deal of work for the political leadership of the young communist movement. He introduced me to Camille Baynac, who was responsible for organizational work in the other departments of the occupied zone. Our meeting with Camille Baynac took place near the Place de la Bastille. He was a cheerful, full of energy man with an optimistic outlook on life. These qualities allowed him to become the leader of the masses, the leader of all youth. In 1939, he was elected a member of the Central Committee of our organization, and earlier he was Federal Secretary in the Department of Nievre, where he had gone through a good school. He gave all his abilities entirely to our struggle and inspired all those around him. At the first meeting, Leroy gave me a password to communicate with the inter-district organizations. The password was half a postcard or a subway ticket. The other half was with another comrade with whom I was to establish contact. In August and September 1941, I had to travel all over the occupied part of France. Fabian's special task was to conduct combat training in the newly created units. His main focus was on the Paris area, where several groups had already been formed and were beginning to operate. We had to establish interaction between three military organizations. The special organization subordinate to the Communist Party leadership, the youth battalions of the Union of Communist Youth, and the special groups of anti-fascist foreigners who were part of the foreign labor movement. A few days after our first meeting at the Closerie de Lille, I saw Danielle Casanova again at the Café Francois-Copé. She introduced me to Arthur Dailide and Eugene Genaf. I was particularly impressed by Arthur's ability to cover many of the most important issues related to the underground struggle at once and to summarize the solutions in a very concise manner. He was responsible for working with personnel for ensuring the safety of our people. Turning to Danielle, he said, pointing at me, "Let him write his biography." Danielle answered him in a tone that allowed no objection. "Hey, he will not write a biography. No one needs that paper as far as he is concerned. I have told you how he made his escape, and I take full responsibility for his appointment." Arthur agreed with her. I had known Eugene Guineuf for a long time, since before the war. Eugene Genaf, a member of the Central Committee and former secretary of the Confederation of Labour of the Paris region, escaped from the internment camp in Chateaubriand on June 18, 1941, hiding under the name of Denis, then Jules. He headed a special military organization. Eugene Genaf was a deeply humane man, had a great gift for subtle analysis, absolute sincerity and high fighting spirit. For all this, I appreciated him very much. The meeting at the Café Francois-Copé made me wonder how Arthur Dailide could have gathered so many underground fighters in one place at once. It couldn't have been a good example to hold a meeting of 4 activists in this café, especially since on this very evening, at this very spot, we were obviously not the only ones waiting for this meeting. This was evident from the subtle signs and behavior of some of the café's visitors. However, from the history of the resistance movement organized by the French Communist Party in 1940-1941 and early 1942, no one will ever be able to erase the pure and noble name of this man who knew all the secrets, endured all the tortures, but did not say a word. After brutal torture, this remarkable communist was shot in May 1942, along with Felix Cadre, Georges Politzer, Jacques Solomon, Jacques Decourt, Arthur Dailide and Jean Cateler, Felix Cadre and Robert Dubois. The 4 of them, under the leadership of Jacques Duclos and Benoît Franchon, carried out the difficult task of operationally directing combat operations during the most difficult period. They coped with this task with honor, as did all communists, rank-and-file party members and leaders, who together learned the hard science of the deep underground, where you had to live and fight. Only the indomitable could withstand the Nazi means and methods of suppressing resistance. One can imagine the magnitude of the family problems we faced, arising from the conditions of our underground life and work. Danielle Casanova obtained the consent of the Central Committee of the Champagne-Bourgogne Interdistrict Association for my wife and her mother to move to Paris. Edwidge became our liaison officer, and Cecile was appointed Commissioner of Women's Personnel and had the opportunity to work under Danielle Casanova, Arthur Dailide and Robert Dubois. I rented for my wife and her mother a 2-room apartment near the metro station Javel in the XE district, on the top floor of the building number 5 on the street Law Serville. I used a handcart to deliver their belongings 2 mattresses, linens, a table, chairs, and some kitchen utensils that they had smuggled over from Reims. We had to live in separate apartments, for Cecile's duties were quite different from what I had to do. The arrest of either of us could have led to a major failure. Cecile studied the female cadres who were being trained as liaisons and the activists recommended by the Union of French Women for Interdistrict Associations. The Union of French Women at the time was led by Claudine Chaumer and Marie Rabait. Danielle Casanova supervised the organization and worked among young people and intellectuals. As in 1939, Cecile often met with Danielle, and yet today I can confess that once every 2 weeks we broke discipline, and with 1,000 precautions met and spent Sunday afternoons together in the Rue de la Serville. It went on like this until March 1942, when Cecile and I were summoned by the party leadership. We were finally allowed to work in the same organization. In April 1942, the French Frontiers et Partisans organization was created in the resistance movement. At the national headquarters of this organization, I was appointed combat commissioner. I was to staff a large operational service of liaison agents. Cecile headed the communications and liaison service. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. At this point in 1941, we were able to see each other only twice a month, and in violation of the instructions approved by the leadership of our party. But we must take into account that we were very young, and I had just escaped from captivity. Fabien and his wife, André, lived together. André had a pseudonym, Arletta. She, a true heroine of the resistance, served as a liaison. No amount of torture broke her after her arrest on November 30, 1942. She was so modest that very few people at the time, apart from her comrades in the Federation of Displaced Persons, knew of the remarkable abilities of this remarkable woman. Before the war, she had been in charge of the French Girls' Union. Now she was to fight for 2.5 years in Hitler's death camps. As the wife of Colonel Fabien, she bore the great title of resistance fighter. It must be known that in the struggle she waged during the dark days of Hitler's occupation, André served as a model for young women and girls of the resistance. André and Fabien occupied a 1-bedroom apartment with a kitchen in an old house on Rue de Benton. A serious problem for them was their daughter Monique, who was 1.5 years old at the time. One day, when André went to the shop to buy milk for the baby, she felt that everyone looked at her suspiciously. Even the sales clerk had a strange look. André never came to the shop again, but the baby had to be fed. Fabien personally knew our brave and kind friends Frescourt, who lived at that time in the XY district in the street Glacier. The Frescourers lived legally and assisted many of our comrades. With their help, it was possible to get milk for the baby. When the fighting for Paris began, it was necessary to shelter the children in a safe place. And when I ask André about this today, she says that it was I who, in September 1941, made an arrangement with a family in Normandy. For the place where their daughter Monique lived was in an area where I had to go for meetings, according to a password given by Camille Bajnac back in August or September 1941. We were talking about the Department of Orne, where one of the groups of battalions of youth that operated in the Fleur St. Georges-Le Grosellier area was located. We were very concerned about the safety of the children, so when we travelled to St. Georges-Le Grosellier in August and September, I made arrangements with the Sagnes family to take Monica with them. As fate would have it, Fabien André found the peace of mind so necessary for the fierce battle we were fighting. On August 2, 1941, I walked with Fabien through Paris and listened to his account of recent events in France. In early July, Fabien had come from the southern zone to the northern zone to set up fighting groups of battalions of youth, both in the Paris area and elsewhere. The question of armed struggle for communist youth was no longer a new one. Here is what Odile Eray and Jean Kapiewicz, commissioners for youth work, wrote about it. We selected the best, bravest young communists to be sent to the battalions of youth. It was considered an honor to be sent there. The creation of armed groups posed a number of problems for us, but the armed struggle itself was not unexpected for us. First of all, since 1940, we had made it a rule to prepare all operations very carefully. In order to minimize arrests, everything had to be done almost military style. From the beginning of 1941, we considered the collection and repair of weapons as one of our main tasks. I remember that we not only collected and repaired weapons, but also studied their disassembly and use. One day my group and I travelled out of town to a wooded area where we practiced the techniques of disassembling and reassembling a revolver. I found official confirmation of these records in the German military newspaper Pariser Zeitung for March 5, 1942, which spoke of the death sentence of 7 communists led by Fernand Zalkinov. They were part of the youth battalions of the X district. The Nazi newspaper wrote, "What has been discovered may serve as a prologue, and should open the eyes of the most stubborn, blind men. The Communist Party, which was liquidated in 1939, exists and is engaged in underground struggle. For example, one of the accused was a member of a youth union before the war. He is an activist of a group of this union in District X. Having returned to their place of residence after the mass resettlement, the scattered comrades gathered again and organized themselves under the pretext of conducting excursions in order not to attract the attention of the police. During these excursions, they studied the works of Karl Marx and the production of explosives. Despite the fact that the groups of the special organization had already carried out a number of sabotage operations, disrupted telephone communications, set fire to several German military warehouses, despite the fact that our youth had also done some work in this direction, organized the collection and repair of weapons, military training, we still have not begun to solve those tasks that were of such paramount importance in August 1941. We are talking about the destruction of Nazi officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers." And so on August 2, 1941, Fabian's mood was clearly ruined. He explained to me that on July 14, large patriotic demonstrations were being held on the grand boulevards at the call of the Communist Party and the Union of Communist Youth, and he, like most of the leaders, had been forbidden to take part. The first demonstration of students and lycée students took place in the Latin Quarter. On July 14, several hundred young people gathered under the tricolour banner and with the singing of the Marseillaise moved in a column straight down the Boulevard Saint-Michel. This demonstration, initiated by students and lycée students of the Paris district, was only a festive procession in the left bank of the sea. On the right bank of the Seine, groups gathered at this time to demonstrate along the route from the Strasbourg Saint-Denis metro station to the Archnelier-Route station. As the column of students and lycée students approached the Sorbonne, it was blocked by a cordon of police. Immediately, the call went out, "All proceed to Strasbourg Saint-Denis." Indeed, while the demonstration was taking place in the Latin Quarter, a huge column of demonstrators, composed mainly of members of the Union of Communist Youth, moved from the Saint-Martin outpost to the Strasbourg Saint-Denis metro station. Among the leaders of the Paris district here were such courageous youth leaders as Jean Compagnon, René Despoy, Maurice Berlimont, and Lucien Germer. The various sectors were led by Jean Lasten, Madine Desrey, Odile Eraigi, Albert Guesquin. At the head of the column was to follow the sector led by Odile Araigi. It included students from the 7 arrondissements of Paris. Groups of the Union of Communist Youth of the Essex district began the movement first. They were led by Adolphe Perelstein, Jean Carr and René Roy. There were also activists André Biver and Louis Talamoni. We must also name such brave comrades as Marc Elfancel, Maurice Charpentier, Raymond Learot and Maurice Deck. 16-year-old Maurice Deck led the group known as the Children's Group because it consisted of 14 to 16-year-olds. René Roy was 19 years old. As the eldest, he was instructed to keep an eye on the children's group that was to open the demonstration. At exactly the specified time, Maurice Deck, with a tricolour banner in his hands, stood in the middle of the roadway of the Boulevard Saint-Denis. René Roy and his group and Jean Bonzon and a group of young people from the Exith arrondissement approached him with their banners. Then from almost all sides, from the streets, from the gates to the boulevard came other groups with their banners. The demonstrators marched at a rapid pace toward the Boulevard Bonne Nouvelle. And within seconds of the Strasbourg Saint-Denis metro station, the students and lycée students who had participated in the demonstration in the Latin Quarter were also coming this way. There were already several thousand people in the column. Most of them were young people, spreading across the entire width of the boulevard. The column with tricolour banners moved towards the metro station Richelieu-Drouot. The melody of the Marseillaise sounded louder and louder. Demonstrators walked in step, scattered on the sidewalks tricolour flags. Numerous passers-by looked at them with sympathy. Singing Marseillaise was periodically replaced by chanting slogans. France to the French. Down with Hitler. Long live the Soviet Union. Long live France. At the movie theatre Rex, demonstrators broke through the first police cordon. "You're doing the same thing as the Boches. Shame on you. You're not French." The police retreated and the column moved into the Richelieu-Drouot neighbourhood. Here the demonstrators were met by a strong cordon of German troops and police. This was not unexpected, but it is not easy to break through such a cordon. Watching his children, René Roy for a moment lost sight of Maurice Deck's group. Looking around, he saw the boys on the corner of Rue Drout. Having knocked down a policeman who was trying to detain him, René rushed to his comrades. It was his duty to get his charges safely back to the 19th arrondissement. Gilbert de Brusselin, who arrived with a group from the 8th arrondissement, was grabbed by the scruff of the neck by a French policeman. Nearby was an elderly man whose chest was adorned with orders. He began to beat the policeman with a cane, saying, "Let him go." Gilbert took advantage of this and broke free. Ernest Nebert and his youth group from the southern suburbs spotted a construction site. A call went out. Everyone for the cobblestones. Everybody behind the cobblestones. Within minutes, Nazi soldiers and police agents retreated in a hail of stones. Throughout the afternoon, there were demonstrations on the boulevards all the way to the Champs-Élysées, in which hundreds and thousands of Parisians took part. Tricolour flags flashed everywhere. 3 tall, beautiful girls, 3 daughters of France dressed in blue, white and red, solemnly marched from the grand boulevards to the opera, from the opera to the Champs-Élysées and back to the grand boulevards. It was a living bouquet of the colours of France, which was fighting in its Paris, a Paris that was under the boot of the occupiers and celebrating the Feast of Liberty and the taking of the Bastille. The July 14, 1941 demonstration had taken place despite the arrests of hundreds of people in the preceding weeks. Now the repression intensified. Collaborationist newspapers wrote that the arrest cells in the police prefecture were overcrowded, that 600 communists had been arrested between June 22 and June 29. On Monday, July 7, 20 detainees, mostly young communists, escaped from the arrest house. All night long, the residents of Harley Street and Dauphine Square behind the courthouse were unable to sleep because of the singing coming from the cells. This singing was drowned out by the noise of metal saws digging into the bars of this new Bastille. After July 14, 2 more demonstrations took place. One on the Rue Belleville in the XX arrondissement and the other in the XV arrondissement. The larger of these was the Belleville demonstration. Representatives of the XID, III, and X arrondissements gathered in the suburb of Temple and on the Quai Jules ferry. Georges Gertman and Simon Lichtenstein made speeches to the demonstrators. They called for every effort to expel the occupiers. After the end of the rally, a huge column with unfurled banners and flags moved along the predetermined route. Demonstrators sang Marseillaise, proclaimed patriotic slogans. Odile Arire. The meeting with groups from the XX, X and XVI districts took place at the Belleville metro station. The groups of the special organization and the battalions of youth did not allow anyone to use the street machines to call for help. The population supported us. La Marseillaise was sung in the column of demonstrators, on the sidewalks, in the open windows of houses. After a short rally at the Pyrenees metro station, we dispersed at the agreed time. No one was arrested. The police arrived too late. On July 27, a demonstration to protest against repression was held by the youth of the XV arrondissement. It was on this day that André Kircher asked Pierre Tourette to enroll him in the battalions of youth. And after all, Kircher was barely 15 years old, and he pretended to be 16 years old. And although Tourette thought that even at 16 Kircher was still too young, he still accepted him into his group. In June, July and early August 1941, the occupiers intensified repression. On July 6, 1941, the collaborationist newspaper Lieu reports the head of communist propaganda in the Paris district, André Bréchet, and 30 of his assistants have been arrested. The prefecture of police has recently arrested 1,200 members of the Communist Party, thus sharply limiting the scope of action by persons instigated by Moscow. The other day, Commissioners Luce and Kugel of the General Information Service established that a large propaganda organization was directed by a man living in Paris, and that he had at his disposal many accomplices who distributed leaflets and pamphlets in the factories of the Paris district. The organized surveillance made it possible to identify a certain Courtois, who lived in a hotel in the Rue Thorigny. When questioned, he refused to give any testimony. A check revealed him to be André Bréchet, aged 40, who had previously worked as a secretary to Prosper Moquet, a former communist deputy from the X5th arrondissement. The records seized from him led to the arrest of 30 underground Communist Party activists. André Masseron was shot on July 24 for singing the Marseillaise. José Roy was shot for uttering words that the occupiers considered offensive to the German army. There was an urgent need to fight back against Nazi terror. The leadership of the Communist Youth Organization decided to hold a large demonstration of the youth of the entire Paris district on August 13, 1941, to protest against the murder of patriots by the German occupiers. At first it was planned to start the demonstration at Saint-Lazare, but due to premature disclosure of information it was necessary to change the route and hold the demonstration near the metro station Strasbourg-Saint-Denis. Daniel Casanova, André Leroy and I set up opposite the Winter Circus to lead the demonstration. We were unable to warn all the groups about the change of location. Police vans blocked all the approaches to Saint-Lazare. We had to send liaisons to the pre-designated assembly points to inform the demonstrators that the demonstration had been moved to the Strasbourg-Saint-Denis station. At 7 p.m., students and lycée students, led by Olivier Souffet, marched from the Strasbourg-Saint-Denis metro station. In the hands of one of them was a large tricolour banner, around which a column of demonstrators began to form. The students and lyceum students moved towards Place de la République along the right sidewalk. The participants in the August 13 march were no doubt inspired by the success of the July 14 demonstration, but while at the Saint-Lazare train station, the demonstrators could be supported by workers and employees returning home after the end of the working day, the Strasbourg-Saint-Denis area was deserted. At Boulevard Saint-Martin, the demonstrators broke through a police cordon. The prefecture called for help from German troops stationed in the area of the High School of Crafts. The German soldiers arrived on motorcycles with sidecars and began to crowd the demonstrators. Most of them found themselves on the right side of the boulevard, separated from the roadway by a high grille. People had nowhere to hide and were squeezed between the grille and the houses. More and more motorcycles with sidecars rolled up, shots rang out, and German soldiers began to chase the fleeing demonstrators. Craftsmen, gatekeepers, shopkeepers came to the aid of the patriots. In front of Maurice Berlemont, who was fleeing from pursuit, the door of the workshop suddenly opened. Together with Maurice in it took refuge and avoided arrest a dozen more demonstrators. Adil Aridi and Nadline Kapievich were cut off in the street now named after René Boulanger. Nadline, running away from the motorcyclists, fell, but immediately jumped up and rushed away. Her narrow skirt was in the way, and her pursuers would have caught up with her, if not for the help of a craftsman who gave Madeleine and several other young communists shelter. Odile also managed to escape. On the Boulevard Saint-Martin, misfortune befell Henry Gauterot, secretary of the Communist Youth Organization of Gentilly. He was severely wounded in the leg. The police arrested him, took him first to the hospital Hotel Dieu, and then, along with other wounded demonstrators, extradited to the Germans. Georges Gertman was stationed next to Samuel Teichmann. They were commissioners of the X, II and IV arrondissements of Paris, where many young Jews persecuted by the Nazis had joined the Communist Youth Organization. Pursued by Nazi soldiers, Georges and Titi fled down Rue René Boulanger to Rue Taylor. At the Rue du Château d'Eau, Titi ran to the right and Georges ran to the left. Titi ran into some house, hoping to take refuge in the cellar, but the Germans managed to find him and arrest him. Henry Gauterot was also arrested. Samuel Teichmann was 20 years old. Henry Gauterot was 21. They died together. The young metallurgist and the young artisan, a Jew and a Frenchman, were shot in the forest of Verrières-le-Buisson, where executions of German anti-fascist soldiers had been carried out since 1940. The collaborationist press reported. On August 15, 1941, the Jew Teichmann and a certain Gauterot were sentenced to death for hostile activity. They participated in a communist demonstration against the German occupation troops. Zia Teichmann was 15 years old when her brother was shot. This is what she recounted. When Titi didn't come home on the evening of August 13, we realized that he had been arrested. My parents searched for him in all the prisons and got nowhere. Late in the evening of August 18, a merchant, the owner of a nearby shop, called from the prison and told us that Samuel was in Santy prison in Paris and that we were allowed to visit him. In spite of the curfew, we set out on foot for the prison. We got there at 1 o'clock in the morning. It's hard to tell you what the visit was like. To our horror, we learned that Titi was sentenced to death. From the prison, we went at once to the Commandant's office of Greater Paris, believing in the possibility of Titi's salvation. For a whole night we walked through Paris. But at the commandant's office, only insults awaited us. And again we returned on foot to the Sante prison, hoping to see TTT, but they wouldn't let us in. We never saw him again. I am sure that on the night of August 13, Samuel suffered a great deal for not seeing us before his execution, and that his death would bring us much grief. However, I am convinced that in front of the Germans he held himself with dignity. The deaths of Samuel Teichelmann and Henry Gauterot were a great loss to the young communists of Paris, among whom both were highly respected and loved. The execution of the patriots served as a signal to organize the struggle. The newspaper Humanite, in the issue for August 21, described the demonstration of August 13, the heaviest of all, but at the same time decisive for the battles to come, as follows. Long live the USSR, long live England, down with Hitler. France to the French, long live France. Von Stolpnagel threatens patriots with death penalty. The demonstration in the neighbourhood of St. Denis showed that the French are not afraid of the occupiers. That is why Reichstag arsonist Göring urgently arrived in Paris to take police action. That is why General von Stolpnagel gave orders to post notices everywhere about the death penalty for belonging to the Communist Party and for any anti-German act. In the department of Pas-de-Calais, the Nazi pigs sentenced a young patriot, Becker, to death. But they dared not carry out the sentence because the workers in that department had taken an oath to exterminate 10 Germans if Becker was executed. A warning has had and always will have force if it is backed up by deeds. So General Stolpnagel, commander of the Nazi forces in France, and General von Schaumburg, commandant of Greater Paris, ordered the execution of Samuel Teichelmann and Henry Gauterot. The blood of these two victims cries out for vengeance and must entail the extermination of 20 Germans. Neither death sentences nor million-dollar rewards to spies will stop the liberation struggle of the French people. On August 27, 5 more communists were shot. The commandant's announcement on this occasion: Roger Henry Nogard from Paris, Alfred Ottino from Saint-Ouen, André Sigon from Drancy, Raymond Justice from Drancy, Jean-Louis Rapina from Pavillon-Saus-Bois, were sentenced to death by a military court for aiding the enemy by participating in a demonstration against the German army. They were all shot. Paris, August 27, 1941. Commander of the troops in France: Alfred Ottino, André Sigon, Raymond Justice and Jean-Louis Rapina were probably arrested during the August 13 demonstration. But this was not quite the case with Roger Henry Nogard. He was none other than Jean Bayou, until 1939 the secretary of the regional organization of the FCP in the department of Seine-et-Oise. No amount of torture broke this courageous comrade. The torturers from the special brigades could not even recognize his real name. All those who knew Jean Bayou speak of him as an outstanding fighter. He will take a worthy place in the history of the resistance. At the beginning of 1940, the leadership of the FCP entrusted him with the task of establishing communication with communists in a number of departments. He was then transferred to a leadership job in the northern district of the department, as staying in Paris became dangerous for him. In addition to Jean Bayou, the leadership included the metallurgist Roger Linnet and Raymond Collin. Roger Linnet was assigned to do what we call work in the masses, and Collin was responsible for producing newspapers, leaflets and other propaganda materials. In 1 year, Jean Bayou did a very great deal of work. He took it to a higher political and military level. The workers of the gunpowder factories in Sevron supplied him with phosphorus sheets, taking cover on the approaches to railroad bridges. The resistance fighters waited for German trains laden with forage. They pelted the cars with self-flammable phosphorus plates. Jean Bayou organized many other operations, together with Georges Paruti, his wife, and Maurice Guerit. He got 200 kilograms of dynamite in a quarry near Clichy-sous-Bois. One day a railroader gave him very valuable information that a train loaded with ammunition was to pass along the county railroad. A steam locomotive without cars will pass in front of it, said the railroader. Then, in about 10 minutes, the train with ammunition will pass through. As night fell on July 16, 1941, Roger Linnet, Alfred Ottino Lumeau from Saint-Aine and Ermlinger from the XVVI arrondissement of Paris snuck along the railroad bed to Ypeux-sur-Seine. Our friends were unable to get real socket wrenches. Homemade tools did not allow them to unscrew the nuts quickly, and yet the job was finished on time. As soon as the control locomotive passed, The rails were removed. Dozens of wagons loaded with ammunition flew under the slope. We were just beginning to conduct combat operations, and 4 of our comrades from the special organization, unfortunately, did not foresee the most difficult stage of the operation, the withdrawal. Having derailed the train, they went through the suburbs, built up with mansions, and found themselves in Fort Brish, where German troops were stationed. They had to take shelter under the trees from the rain and wait for the curfew to end. At dawn, they joined the stream of workers going to work in the northern suburbs. That's how they miraculously managed to get to St. Owen, on Rue Rogier, to Alfred Ottino's house. There they warmed themselves by the warm hearth, drank a cup of ersatz coffee and some wine. The next day, Jean Bayou, alerted by his contact, met with Roger Linnet. "You have conducted an excellent operation," he praised Roger. The able-bodied men of Epinette had been mobilized to guard the railroad tracks, but the population was sympathetic to the resistance. The people of this working-class suburb were anxious to keep those who had derailed the train out of the hands of the authorities. Jean Bayou continued his work. On July 20, 1941, a steam locomotive was placed on the turntable at Plain St. Denis, and the track on the outbound branch was narrower than that of the locomotive. Together with the tender, it fell into a hole, and for this reason the depot was idle for more than a day. On July 20, the Germans announced a cash prize of 20,000 francs to anyone who would identify the organizers of the train wreck in Epin. Realizing that such whistleblowers are not easy to find, the Germans on August 19 increased the amount of the prize to 1,000,000 francs. Von Stoltenagel issued an order to shoot anyone who would carry out communist propaganda or even attempt to do so. Jean Bayou responded to this threat with daily speeches to the workers. On August 20, under the protection of a cover group, Bayou gave a speech at the market in Aulnay-sous-Bois. After recovering from a brief scare, the housewives began to listen to him attentively. He was pleased that the impromptu rally had gone well. After walking some distance away from the market, he signaled his bodyguards to leave him alone. However, Bayou was already being followed by a French policeman. As soon as Jean Bayou was left alone, the scoundrel detained our comrade and took him to the police station in Aulnay and then to the police prefecture. Bayou's was tortured and then extradited to the Germans. In the Exith arrondissement, the French police made mass arrests of Jews. On August 21, the press report. It was necessary to blockade the Exith arrondissement for several hours in order to carry out these arrests. These measures were taken in connection with the communist demonstrations recently held in the Exith arrondissement, in which many Jews are known to have participated. The Communist Party leadership was justifiably in a hurry to meet the enemy with blow for blow. I met daily with Eugene Genoff in the Clamart, Sivers, Viroflay or Bois de Boulogne forests. We both understood the responsibility entrusted to us. It was necessary to eliminate Nazi officers and soldiers in response to the increasing repression. It was an urgent task. We had to respond to the terror. It was not enough just to write in slogans in newspapers and leaflets that 10 Germans will pay with their lives for one shot patriot. It was necessary to move from words to deeds. Fabien informed me that, in spite of the full assistance of the leadership of the Communist Youth Organization of the Paris district, certain difficulties were encountered in his work. Of course, Albert Guesquin continued to get the bravest boys for the battalions of youth. Of course, sabotage was already being carried out. But no killing. To turn Paris into a battlefield where the dead would not only be on one side, it was not an easy task for us, above all morally. The young communists of France drew from the teachings of communism a deep sense of social justice, consistent humanism, respect for the individual and for all peoples. It was comparatively easy to make it clear that true humanism implied the destruction of the Nazi regime, which was based on contempt for the human being, that if that regime had won, humanity would have been set back tens of millions of years. Explaining that we were fighting in the interests of France and all countries, including Germany itself, was a little more difficult, but everyone soon realized it well enough. The real difficulties were encountered when it was necessary to convince our comrades that in order to destroy this regime, it was necessary to destroy its entire army, that the front also passes through Paris, and therefore it was necessary to destroy, in cold blood, the soldiers of the army occupying France. It was necessary to quickly create the conditions for striking at German units, companies, combat posts, then as part of the new army, of which we were the heralds, to take part in the liberation of the entire country. Fabian and I met with the leaders of all the combat groups. We resolved the issues related to the conduct of numerous sabotage operations, the destruction of advertising windows of Nazi and collaborationist organizations. But still remained unresolved was the difficult question of the destruction of soldiers of Hitler's army. Even at the most critical moments, we still saw a human being in the German. I didn't know Paris very well at the time, and Fabian, on the contrary, came out of the youth of Belleville-Menil-Montant. He was a combination of Gavroche and Jules Valles. He had the blood of the communards of 1871 in his veins. We often met him in the early morning in the neighbourhood of the Arénes de l'Utuil, in the Place de l'Odéon, near Sully-Morlan. The Latin Quarter was his headquarters. Fabian walked in all directions with a book in his hands, not to look like a student, but because he really liked to read. He was especially fond of Thal's book Napoleon, which the Nazis simply missed the chance to withdraw from circulation, and in August 1941 this book had a very special meaning. Both Fabian and I read with great interest Captain Charton's work The Free Corps in World History. This book constituted a whole instruction, although our struggle was quite different. In order to overcome our comrades' prejudices against the destruction of the Nazis, we decided, in violation of the requirements of conspiracy, to gather for a 3-day training on August 15, 16 and 17 in Ladi, about 20 fighters, mostly group leaders from the Paris battalions of youth. Ladi station is located on the Paris-Étampes railway line. Passengers who boarded the train at the Austerlitz station on August 15, 1941, and saw barefoot young men bending under the weight of backpacks, had no idea that these could be the very dangerous terrorists about whom the collaborationist newspapers wrote with such anger. Tourist camps were indeed widespread, especially after 1936. Groups of travellers could often be seen on Sundays and holidays on the banks of rivers and in the forest thickets of the departments of Seine and Oise and Seine and Marne. If at that time a traveller arriving at the small commune of Ladi, located on the edge of the Bosse forest in the department of Seine-et-Oise, came out of the station and went up a little to the left, he would immediately find several houses and cafés. We had to cross the railroad track and climb up a rather steep slope to a large grove. It was there that we camped. This gathering, and we held 2 or 3 others in other places, proved decisive for the deployment of the armed struggle in the Paris area. Lodian conducted a series of military training sessions. Throwing training grenades, walking at night by compass, physical training, and so on. We must not forget that few of the members of the battalions of youth had been in the military service, and even fewer had participated in the 1939-1940 hostilities or the war in Spain. However, our gathering in no way resembled what the Boy Scouts were doing. Amado and another girl started a fire and began to prepare lunch. The observers, who had taken their seats, pretended to be reading or making crafts. After lunch, we stood in a circle. Without raising my voice, I talked about the international situation, the recent battles, the tasks before us. First of all, it was necessary to talk about the international situation and to give people hope. On the Soviet-German front, the Red Army was retreating, but the fighting was becoming more and more persistent, especially in the direction of Smolensk, Moscow. In August 1935, at the age of 20, I was fortunate enough to be in the Soviet Union for the Congress of the Communist Youth International. Together with Victor Joannes and Elie Duguay, we spent several weeks in the Urals, where we made reports on the work of the Congress. The editor-in-chief of the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda was with us. I visited Magnitogorsk, whose population numbered hundreds of thousands of people, workers of metallurgical plants, iron ore mines. We saw the giant Uralmash combine, a large metallurgical production facility employing 4. The director at that time was a woman. In Chelyabinsk, we visited a tractor factory where 20,000 people worked, where every hour a tractor came off the conveyor belt. I explained that today this factory in Chelyabinsk produces 1 or 2 tanks per hour, that these machines are immediately delivered to the front. I told him that the Urals were at such a great distance from the front that no German airplane could bomb these factories, and that many other factories had entirely evacuated and settled in the Urals. With regard to the retreat of the Soviet troops, I recalled the old strategy of Kutuzov and cited the example of the actions of the partisans, as reported by Moscow radio. Are we not able to do for our country, for our ideal, what the young Russian communists are doing for their country? I asked and continued. No, we have no right to allow German divisions to be sent to the Soviet front. The trains must not set off, carrying troops, combat equipment produced by our factories, products produced by our agriculture. After all, we are soldiers. We will fight on the same front with Soviet soldiers, with the British, with the French from the armed forces of Free France. The Communist Party leadership expects more from us in these difficult times than we are doing now. Will we allow patriots to be shot with impunity? The Nazis have only one language, the language of force. There is only one means to force them to retreat, and that is to retaliate for every patriot shot. When I had finished speaking, I asked the participants of the gathering to say what they were thinking, from the bottom of their hearts. In my 26 years, I was one of the oldest among all my brothers and sisters in the struggle, and understood the feelings that are born in such days, when you have to fight for your ideals, for your country, when death constantly hovers over you. The conditions of the underground struggle suggested that there was no arguing. Besides, we were all part of a military organization where few words were spoken with complete freedom of expression, quite seriously. Without labeling the speakers, seeking to fully understand them, we listened attentively to each other. All those present spoke. No other meeting has been so useful. True, we had no weapons. Certainly we had no combat experience, and if we did, it was very little. The main problem was humanistic sentiment. Even in war, it's not easy to kill at the front, but before you appear on a Parisian street with 2 of your comrades to kill a Nazi officer or soldier, you have to realize what it means. One comrade, who later became an excellent franc-tirer, used to say, "No, I don't want to kill soldiers, only officers. A soldier may turn out to be a German anti-fascist worker." Another declared, "I don't want to destroy even a German officer unless he is an SS man. I have to be sure that it is really a Nazi. After all, the person killed may turn out to be a humanist professor. We have to understand the authority that the Communist Party of Germany, the party of Ernst Thälmann, had among us, among the young people, which since 1933 had waged the hardest struggle in the underground against Hitler. When our French comrades arrived in the Nazi camps, Hitler had already exterminated 300,000 German anti-fascists, the vast majority of them communists. The Nazi isolated the Communist Party of Germany, and since 1933, not only by the forces of the Gestapo, but also relying on people blinded by Nazi propaganda, destroyed the best sons of Germany. How many young people of this country, driven to fanaticism, carried away by National Socialist demagogy, intoxicated by military successes, were able to believe that they were serving the interests of their people by participating in the suppression of anti-fascists. Unfortunately, there were millions of them. To destroy soldiers, officers, non-commissioned officers of the German army meant to fight for their country, for all European countries, including Germany, which had fallen into the iron fetters of Nazism. Destroying Hitler and his war machine could not be accomplished with mere words. It could only be achieved by practical deeds at the cost of many sacrifices. Nazism could not disappear at the request of Quakers or under the influence of beautiful speeches. It was necessary to destroy its army, to crush its ideology. A year later, our frontiers and partisans were no longer faced with the theoretical and moral problems that had to be solved now. All those who joined the survivors of the heavy underground fighting on June 6, 1944, acted without hesitation. In August 1941, we had no doubt read in our newspapers about what Nazism had done in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, but we did not yet have the main thing that nothing could replace, the experience of the events we had lived through. Then I realized that we were not the only ones who had traveled this path of understandable hesitation. Apparently, the Soviet young communists did not immediately overcome their natural aversion to murder. It was necessary to witness the crimes of the Nazis, to see with their own eyes burned towns and villages, murdered women, children, and the elderly. There was everything, hundreds, thousands of ordures in the Soviet Union, the destruction of millions of prisoners of war, nameless victims. And only after all this did the sacred anger of the Russian people and Soviet youth blaze up. Of all the frontiers who gathered in Ladi on August 15, 1941, only 5 of us were left alive. Maurice Lebert escaped death in the Mauthausen death camp. Gilbert Bruslin's picture was hung by the Nazis on walls all over France and printed in all the newspapers. So at the beginning of 1942 we sent him to London, from where he returned in 1944. Andrei Kirshin was imprisoned in Bochum for 3 years, enduring the ordeal. Antoine Danduren, a student, crossed to the Southern Zone in 1942, where he continued the struggle until 1944. All the others perished. Isidore Greenberg was executed by guillotine on Petain's orders. Many others were shot between 1942 and 1943 or fell fighting in the streets like Debret. Fabian died on the battlefield in Alsace on December 27, 1944, as commander of the Paris Brigade formed from rebellious Parisians. All of them were the first soldiers of the night who paved the way for the creation of a powerful, invisible army of French internal resistance forces fighting for the liberation of France. Their initial hesitation in no way detracts from the greatness of their exploits. On the contrary, it only emphasizes the importance of their work, which will one day take its rightful place in history. But, alas, at present, official history has in some way consigned their names to oblivion. When we were in Lade, we were already aware of some examples of successful actions. The attack on the insulator factory in Vitry, the killing of a Nazi officer at the Orleans Gate in the first half of August, 2 weeks before Fabian killed a Nazi officer in broad daylight in Paris. Maurice Lebert and Albert Manuel of Alphaville avenged André Masseron. It took place near the gates of Orleans. Maurice of them, all from the battalions of youth. Maurice Lebert, who had 2 years of underground combat experience, one of the bravest fighters of the entire resistance movement, Albert Manuel, a young anti-fascist, Spanish by birth, and 17-year-old Marcel Borderia. For hours they watched the passing officers and soldiers, and every time they showed indecision at the last moment. Time was running out. Marcel Borderia was living in Saint-Ouen. Lebert and Manuel decided that he must leave so that he could get home before curfew. Curfew was approaching. Lieber did not want to let Manuel go, who would not have enough time to sneak into the safe house. Hey, it's against the rules of conspiracy, but you'll have to sleep at my place in Montrouge tonight, Lieber. It was getting dark, and then they noticed between the Orleans Gate and Montrouge officer. He had just broken up with a girl of light behaviour among those we called horizontal collaborators. There was not a soul around. Our 2 friends acted in concert, without collusion. They attacked the German. André Masseron was at night. Lieber and Manuel did not have leaflets with the text. For one shot patriot, 10 German officers will pay with their lives. Marcel Borderia, leaving, forgot to give them to his comrades. Still, the Nazis had to realize what killing an officer meant. Indeed, the occupiers had learned well that such an example could become all too contagious. Not a single newspaper reported the officer killed at the Orleans Gate. Marcel Borderia left his comrades and reached the Clydenham Court Gate after the curfew. He was apprehended as he exited the subway. Fortunately, Marcel was living legally at the time and his personal documents were in order. Nevertheless, he had to spend the night at the police station. He could feel the leaflets he was carrying burning his body. Fortunately, there was no search and he was released. He greedily enjoyed the air of freedom, not yet knowing what happened at the Orleans Gate after he left. On the eve of our gathering at Ladi on August 14, Maurice Lebert organized an attack on the insulator factory at Vitry. This factory produced products needed for German submarines. This was reported to us by Raymond Breisler and Jane Lastu. Maurice Lebert arrived at the factory by bicycle and saw Marcel Borderia and the student Antoine Danduren arriving before him. The case of Antoine Danduren is illustrative. In 1940, he decided to join the struggle against the occupiers and found that there was only one such organization in the Latin Quarter, the Union of Communist Students of Paris. He joined this union, he claimed, only to fight the occupiers, and became one of the first volunteers for battalions of youth. Here is Maurice Lebert's account of this attack. Antoine Danduren and Marcel Borderia had the task of covering my withdrawal. I entered the factory together with the workers, marked my attendance on a forged card, and went to the warehouses where there was equipment intended for the Germans. I threw 2 Molotov cocktails there. At that time, bottles filled with gasoline were used for this purpose. The neck was plugged with a rag, which was set on fire before throwing the bottle. It all burned very well. When I wanted to leave the factory, someone yelled, "Get the arsonist." Immediately the factory gates closed. After a little scuffle, I managed to leave through a side door. We had to escape, but the planned escape plan was not executed. My bicycle was left at the factory, and from it the authorities established that it was I who had organized this sabotage. A young worker, Brezier, was arrested, but he had nothing to do with the arson and was released a few days later. At the same time as the sabotage in Vitry, arson was organized at the fuel depot at Chouazy Station and at the lamp factory in Ivry. The result of all these diversions was summed up at our meeting in Lardy on August 21. The day before this meeting, a group from District Exai, consisting of Gilbert Brusselin, Fernand Zolkinau, Tony Blancourt, Asher Simai Lat, Pierre Milan, Christian Penault, and Albert Guesquin, was to derail an ammunition train near the station of Nogent-le-Perret. Bonaparte had all the necessary information, and only one thing was missing: a winding wrench. When we supplied our sabotage groups with the necessary tools, the number of derailed railroad trains with German troops and military equipment increased many times. In 1943, every week up to 30 sabotage operations were carried out. On the night of August 20, our comrades, going out to the railroad, suddenly heard the tapping of a hammer on the rails and realized that the operation could not be carried out. The bypasser was checking the tracks, and the comrades had no choice but to leave. At this time, returning to Paris after curfew had begun was out of the question. The group had to spend the night on the side of the road leading out of Neuilly-sur-Marne. In the morning everyone went home. Gilbert Brusselin, Fernand Zolkinau, and Albert Guesquin were scheduled to meet Fabien at the Barbie metro station. At 8 o'clock the meeting took place. Fabien, Gilbert Brusselin, and Albert Guesquin entered the subway, while Fernand Zolkinov remained outside. Albert Guesquin stopped near the subway diagram, pretending to scrutinize it, when in reality he was supposed to be covering for his two comrades. At this time Gilbert Brusselin and Fabien were sauntering by the place where the first-class cars usually stopped. Soon a brilliant Nazi officer appeared near them and stopped with a haughty look, waiting for the train. Fabien said quietly to Gilbert Brusselin, "May, pay attention, this one will pay with his life for our comrades." The train arrived and the carriage doors opened. The passengers stepped out onto the platform. The Nazi midshipman Alphonse Moser was about to enter the carriage, but at that moment 2 shots rang out and the Nazi collapsed on the platform. In the carriage were Tank Sergeant Hans Gierect and another soldier of the occupation army, but they did not move, did not even try to pursue our comrades. Is it surprise? Is it fear? Fabien did not hesitate for a second. He rushed as fast as he could up the steps to the exit, shouting, "Stop him," and pretending to pursue the shooter. Brusselin, revolver in hand, covered his comrade's retreat. Albert Guesquin remained on the platform and watched everything that was happening there. The tank sergeant and his fellow soldier picked up the corpse of the Nazi officer and placed it on a bench. When the police arrived and looked for the witness, no one was willing to testify. Who knows what kind of trouble you can get from these Germans and from this police? So little like the French. At the subway, Fabien and Gilbert Brusselin mixed with the citizens hurrying to the service. They quickly slipped through the alley of Montmartre, came out on the square Villette at the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. From there the whole of Paris was visible, occupied but not subdued to the occupiers. Paris, humiliated, could once again proudly raise its head, thanks to the feat of its 3 best sons. Fabien said only a few words. "Here is Titi avenged." Brusselin and Fabien parted ways. In response to Nazi terror, a German officer was killed in Paris in broad daylight. Hundreds of Parisians witnessed this act of retaliation, and in the morning thousands, tens of thousands of people learned about it. It was not yet noon, and the murder was already being talked about among the housewives in the queues outside the stores. "You know, a German officer was killed in the subway. It's the work of young people, they're so brave." The collaborationist press and the headquarters of the occupation troops were well aware of the resonance this event would receive. Condolences to Mr. Occupiers, abundant stream flowed from different sides, from the Vichy and Parisian collaborators. One of the Vichy newspapers wrote, "Communists, as spies of London and Moscow, seek to destroy the fruitful cooperation that we have established with the Germans." On August 23, by order of the German military commandant, the following announcement appeared on all the houses in the Paris district. On August 21, a member of the German army was killed in Paris. In this connection I ought, as of August 23, to consider as hostages all Frenchmen, both those arrested by the German authorities in France and those detained for transfer to these authorities. In the event of repeated acts of violence, the number of hostages to be shot will be determined by the gravity of the acts committed. Paris, August 21, 1941. For the commander of the troops in France, Lieutenant General Schomberg. Contrary to the assurances of some historians, no hostages were shot after the act of retaliation at the Barbie metro station. But the Germans had long been carrying out shootings all over France. By then, hundreds of Frenchmen of various political persuasions had already fallen victim to the punishers. Here are the names of some of their number. Samuel Karp, shot on August 27, 1940, in Bordeaux for an act of violence against the German army. He shook his fist at a passing column of occupying troops. Pierre Rocher, a 19-year-old coppersmith, shot in La Rochelle for cutting a cable on the La Rochelle-Rouen line. Roger Anne from Cherbourg, shot at Saint-Lô on December 1, 1940, for communist activity. Jacques Bonsagean, a 27-year-old engineer, shot on December 23, 1940, for accidentally pushing a German. Joseph Maydick, a communist activist from Le Havre, shot on May 18, 1941, for cutting the telephone cable on the Le Havre-Paris line with a group of a special organization. After the June events, repression intensified. The occupiers tried to intimidate the people of the country. On August 15, the following warning appeared in the press and on the walls of houses in Paris. We warn you. The French Communist Party has been dissolved. Any of its activities in France is forbidden. Any person engaged in communist activity or propagandizing communist ideas or attempting to do so, in short, anyone who in one way or another supports the machinations of the communists, is declared an enemy of Germany. Perpetrators are put to death by a German military tribunal. Commander of the troops in France, General von Stulpnagel. Cut a German telephone cable, death penalty. Threatened with a fist, death penalty. Speaking offensively against the German army, death penalty. Pushed a German soldier, harboured an Allied pilot, sang Marseillaise, engaged in or attempted to engage in communist propaganda. For all separately, death penalty. On July 16, 1941, Hitler declared, shoot anyone who looks askew, and on July 23, Marshal Keitel added, the army must inflict terror in order to nip in the bud any attempt at resistance. There were already many reports of the execution of French patriots, but the report of August 23, 1941, unlike the previous ones, was about the fact that henceforth those killed would be on both sides of the barricades. The shot outside the Barbe metro station sounded as a response to Nazi terror and a call for armed struggle throughout France. A few days after the operation at the Barbe metro station, I was to meet André Leroy and Danielle Casanova at the Saint-Lazare train station. André and I were the first to arrive. Then Danielle came, and she was glowing with a special joy. I have a note for you. From Jacques, she said in a low voice, and took out a small note from her purse, which at the time could not help but excite us. Bravo, young people. Keep up the good work. Frederick was the pseudonym of Jacques Duclos. The fiery and courageous demonstration of August 13, 1941 in the Strasbourg-St. Denis area, the killing of a Nazi officer in broad daylight, the unfolding of the militant activities of the Union of Communist Youth. All this Jacques Duclos greeted in a few words. We felt our hearts merging in this time full of drama. There was no other way to inspire our frontiers to fight, which the Union of Communist Youth considered one of its primary tasks. The leadership of the French Communist Party decided to exterminate the Nazi officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers who occupied our country. This was the most important party decision. The deployment of groups of frontieros in combat served as the basis for the creation of a new army, which France needed. But making such a decision was not easy. It was prepared in a hard struggle with strong countercurrents. Even people devoted to communist ideals, including many of the communists who remained in legal positions, spoke out against such a decision. Not all communists could live and work underground, and some of them were afraid of possible reprisals. At that time, I once came across an illegally produced leaflet. It happened after the events at the Barbie metro station. One of the party cells in Paris wrote that it was about settling scores between Germans or with some of the hangers-on from Place Pigalle. There was a departure from a substantive explanation of events. The military offensive was not supported by a political offensive. The overwhelmingly German hostile population did not yet understand the nature of our struggle. They feared punishment and condemned the actions of the emerging army of shadows. With the help of powerful mass media, appealing to the basest feelings that can arise in a human being, public opinion was skillfully formed in the spirit of the Munich Agreement, and our operations have not yet allowed to change these minds. There was nothing to be surprised that fear had taken possession of many. It was not uncommon to hear good people, reading the threatening announcements of the Nazi military command, say to us, "Let them kill Germans if they like, but let them say directly that they did." We had to wait for a serious deterioration in the living standards of the French, for the spread of active armed struggle throughout occupied France, for the first successes of the Soviet army, for the conditions for political victory to ripen. At the same time, something happened that neither the Germans nor the Vichyists expected: the instinctive opposition of Frenchmen and Frenchwomen to the destruction of patriots. Having once been to an incident, Saint-Exupéry said, people no longer feel fear of it. Only the unknown frightens people. But if a person faces it, it ceases to be an unknown. This assessment proved true both for a member of the resistance, before he first slew the enemy, and for the majority of the population after they learned the brutality of repression. Fabian's feat of shooting down a Nazi officer in broad daylight in Paris has nothing to do with an act of terrorism. On the contrary, he is the first swallow in a deadly battle with the occupier. In spite of the most brutal repression, the Frontier organization grew numerically, and our first actions prepared the possibility of strikes against the German garrisons in Paris. Against this background, the first shot at the Barbie metro station, which was mentioned in the warning of the German military command, took on exceptional significance. It awakened the consciousness of the people as it responded to their spiritual state, especially the mood of the youth of France. On August 27, 1941, in Versailles, in the barracks of Borny-Debord, in the presence of Pierre Laval, de Brinon, de Loncle, the Prefect Chevalier and Colonel Derville, there was a review of several hundred fascists. They were mostly criminal elements whom French reaction had managed to round up from police stations and prisons. They were all dressed in the uniforms of Wehrmacht soldiers. Cardinal Baudrillard called them Crusaders of the New Age. Pétain addressed them with a pompous proclamation. This army of hangmen was called the Legion of French Volunteers, fighters against Bolshevism. On August 27, 1941, a young man with red hair could be seen at the gate of the barracks in Versailles. From the crowd of volunteers, he closely followed the movement of important persons who came to the review. This is 20-year-old Paul Collet, a native of Cayenne. He had once been a member of the organization of the Fiery Crosses, led by Colonel de la Roquille. He left that organization as soon as his chief joined the National Council, which was headed by the ceremony was drawing to a close. Paul Collet emerged from the crowd of those assembled, drew a pistol from a roll, and discharged it fully into the leaders standing nearby. Laval and Dia were severely wounded. Legion Commander Derville and another of the volunteers were lightly wounded. This act of retaliation and the shooting of Communist Fabian was separated by only a week. The former member of the Fiery Crosses shot traitors, the French frontierer shot occupiers. In both cases, it was a response to repression. On their long road of dishonor, it was after the events at the Barbie metro station that Pétain and his accomplices reached rock bottom. On August 14, 1941, the Vichy government, as a gift to the occupiers, began chopping off the heads of Frenchmen for being communists. German punitive teams were joined by the Vichy guillotine. Pétain, Darlan, Hunziker, Puchet, Bergier, Barthélemy on August 14, 1941 signed a law that created special sections in the courts of appeal in the occupied zone and in the military tribunals in the southern zone. The initiator of this sinister action was the Minister of the Interior, Puchet, who was closely associated with industrial and financial circles. The law he prepared mirrored the darkest times of the Middle Ages. The Nazi newspaper Laurier wrote on August 24 and 25, 1941, that Puchet reaffirmed his firm determination to crush communist agitation. He has exposed the provocations of the communists in the occupied zone and invented for them a swift and visible punishment. Once signed into law, it was submitted on August 14 to the German military command in Paris for approval. A report by Nazi Major Boimelberg dated August 22, 1941, needs no comment. Record of a conversation with councillors Ingran and Wilhelm with the participation of Lieutenant Roos. Councillor Ingran stated that the measures indicated in the memo would be retroactive. Our military command must decide whether this can be accepted or whether the effective date of the provisions of the law should be strictly defined and the law applied only to cases currently pending. According to Ingren, the French government would like the assurance of the German command that it would not object to the principle of retroactivity in this law. The memo submitted emphasizes that the right to impose death sentences on communist leaders does not belong only to the extraordinary courts. This right would be given to the investigating troika so that sentences would be handed down on the spot. Councillor Ingren stated that the death penalty will be carried out by guillotining in the squares of the city as a deterrent measure. This document fundamentally altered all legal principles in force in France. The introduction of the principle of the retroactive force of law nullifies the most sacred principle of liberalism. There can be no punishment if there has been no law. Such lawlessness inspired disgust in the Nazis themselves. Major Boimelberg said to his assistant, "Do you know the story of the townspeople of Calais?" In 1347, King Edward II at Eyes of England announced that he would pardon the inhabitants of besieged Calais if 6 townspeople would come out to him with uncovered heads, barefoot, with ropes around their necks and hand over the keys to the city and put themselves at his complete disposal. The mayor of the town, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, sent no one, but went himself. And do you know what the councillor said to me when the document was read, according to which 6 of his countrymen were condemned to death? He asked me if the Germans would be satisfied. The Nazis amended the text of the law before them. They determined that special sections should try all cases in closed court. Public executions were forbidden for fear that it would cause unrest. During a meeting of the Council of Ministers in Vichy, Pétain familiarized himself with the text of the law and the changes made to it by the German side. He asked, couldn't it be done in a better way? I am at your service, Mr. Marshal, replied the Minister of Justice Barthélemy. But how do we get out of the situation if all the prisons are already overcrowded, and we have just reopened 17 military prisons closed since the beginning of the war? Loudun, Argentan, Bernay, Falaise, Louviers, Vire, Beaune, Bessy, Cholet, Sigres, Vendôme, Saint-Paul, Yvetot, Dinan, Genga. Pétain wryly replied to this, "Plenty of teams will make room for you." In August-September 1941, and the months that followed, the German executioner platoons and Pétain's guillotine did indeed work at full capacity. Following the murder of André Macero and José Roy in Paris, 5 communist activists, among them Jean Bayou, on August 29, 1941, 3 Gaullists were sentenced for espionage, 40-year-old Lieutenant Captain Etienne Dorve, 36-year-old Maurice Barrier, and Jean-Louis Dornic. They were all shot by the Nazis. On the same day, the press reported the death sentences in Paris for the former secretary of the FCP section of the XVIe arrondissement, 40-year-old electrician André Brechet, Emile Bastard and Abraham Trazy-Brutsky. On August 28 at dawn, the 3 communists were guillotined by the French themselves in Santy prison. All of them had already been sentenced to long terms of imprisonment for communist propaganda and were in prison. The Vichy government organized a retrial of them and, on the basis of a sinister legal farce, sentenced them to death. 2 days before the court that was to try them a second time, the executioner had already been warned and was preparing to execute them. On Wednesday, August 27, André Brechet wrote a farewell letter to his wife. "My dear wife, you probably already know that I was recently summoned to court. We were 13 communists and Sampex was with us. We didn't know why we were summoned, but we didn't care. And here we were being tried a second time, without a defense counsel, except for one who was appointed by the court on the spot and didn't know the merits of the case. An extraordinary tribunal, all in red, terrible, cruel sentences, full of hatred. You yourself know that for 20 years you, my dear Marie, together with our dear little Georges, have been everything in life to me. Now I ask you to be courageous, to show the utmost selflessness, for alas, you will need it more than I will. These gentlemen have sentenced me to the severest punishment imaginable, beyond which nothing else exists. Yes, my dear, I have, take courage, been sentenced to death. Tomorrow morning, the day after tomorrow, perhaps tonight, there will be only a memory of me. Tell our dear son about me sometimes. Tell him that his father died defending his life, the life of all the suffering, the humiliated, the labourers, the workers, and the life of our beautiful country. I think George said that the road to victory is paved with graves. So let my grave be in line with the others, and if it enables our column to advance, even by a few meters, then my earthly journey will not be in vain. Tell my son that I met death proudly, as a communist regretting nothing in my honest working life. And for you, my dear, let this be the last grief I will cause you. Forgive me and know that in this last hour of my life all my loved ones, and especially you two, are in my heart. To you both, my last thoughts and my last embrace. Frenchmen, long live the Communist Party, long live France. André Bréchet. André bis to the execution recounted. André Bréchet literally threw himself under the guillotine knife with the cry of "Long live the French Communist Party." Emile Bastard and Abraham Trezebrucki met death just as courageously. They received to the satisfied. They received from the Vichyistes a sacrifice in the form of French blood. Despite the repression of the occupiers and the Vichy authorities, guillotining and shootings that threatened any Frenchman, the struggle continued. We clenched our fists tighter and gritted our teeth. In the evening I was alone in my room in the Rue Vares. I usually put my revolver under my mattress. I reflected on our struggle, on comrades shot and guillotined. We must be firm, I thought in the oppressive silence. A political and military battle was brewing between us and the occupiers, who were supported by traitors from Paris and Vichy. All of our supporters were worried about the fate of their loved ones as the Nazis and Vichy began shooting and guillotining our parents, relatives, friends and brothers in the struggle. I thought of my father-in-law Maurice Remagon, arrested on October 10, 1940 for communist activities and held in Clairvaux prison, my brother-in-law Pierre, arrested on the same charge. Now many options I did not turn over still came to the conclusion. We have only one way, to intensify our strikes against the enemy. This is the only possible response to brutal repression. After Fabian set an example, combat operations in Paris became more frequent. Gone forever was the time when the Nazis could kill with impunity, as they had done for over a year. Now they had to bring in significant military forces to fight against the army of popular avengers, against the new French army that was being created in the occupied territory. On September 3, Asher Samaya and a group of fighters from the battalions of youth of the Zixith Arrondissement, led by Gilbert Brustlin and Fernand Zalkinov, eliminated a Nazi officer at the entrance to the hotel terminus opposite the Gare de l'Orient. The next day, on September 4, a special organization group eliminated the traitor Zeiton in Lila. This group later became known as the Valmy Group. On September 5, a group of the special organization consisting of Colonel Dumont, Conrado Meyer Must, Kröchlik, a German anti-fascist from the International Brigade, and his French wife Lucienne set fire to a German garage in Vincennes. On September 6, Nazi officer Blasius Hoffmann was strolling with a young Parisian woman on the Rue Perchamp, enjoying the happiness of life in a conquered country. A group from the battalions of youth, composed of André Kergden, Pierre Tourette and Bernard Laurent, interrupted his heartfelt outpourings. 2 bullets fired from a revolver, and Blasius ended his career in the Exefi district in the service of the Führer. On September 10, the youngest Franc-tireur, André Kirschen, with the help of Bernard Laurent and Pierre Tourette, slew a Nazi non-commissioned officer. André Kirschen, in his 15.5 years, was the youngest Franc-tireur and at the same time the first of the first. This fact was not taken into account by the Ministry of Justice, but for this Kirschen rightfully won the love of his surviving comrades, resistance fighters and their families. On the same day, September 10, and the next day, September 11, the inseparable Maurice Pfefferman and Maurice Feld killed 2 Nazi officers, one on the Rue Lafayette, the other on the Boulevard Magenta. On September 15, it was the turn of another German officer to end his career. September 19 was the first major operation involving 2 groups of 9 men. Attacked a German military garage in the Exai district. The operation was led by Conrado Mirete Must and Maurice Lebert. They removed French workers from the garage and threw incendiary bottles at it. Unfortunately, the fire was quickly extinguished. In August and September 1941, repression against resistance fighters intensified. Keitel immediately approved the hostage code presented by von Stolpnagel. In a secret order given to all German authorities in the occupied territories, he wrote, "It must be borne in mind that human life in the occupied territories is in most cases of no value, and positive results of intimidation can only be achieved by exceptionally brutal measures." On September 16, the Nazis shot 10 patriots. Here are their names: Lucien Materon, 21, Lucien Clement, 29, André Bonin, 24, Albert Gaway, 21, 19, Gilles Vage Opol, 50, René Joly, 41, Lucien Blum, 62, Isidore Bernheim, 72. On the same day, September 16, 3 communist lawyers and 9 other patriots were shot, including Georges Petard, Antoine Orge and Michel Ronicus, on charges of communist propaganda. Adrien Nunn, as a compiler of communist leaflets. Roger Peyre and Victor Markel, for assaulting a German soldier. René Anjolvier, as a distributor of communist leaflets. François Herpin A.D., as leader of a communist group arrested while committing sabotage. Pierre Guinoy, for possession of weapons and communist leaflets. Georges Massy, for possession of weapons. Daniel Lubier and Marie Sapere, for possession of weapons. On September 18, Raymond Gandin and Eric Louis Texier of Argenteuil were shot for participating in a communist demonstration against the German army. All newspapers reported daily on shootings for Communist Party membership and weapons possession. In the Southern Zone, on September 11, 1941, Pétain ordered a court-martial to be held in Clermont-Ferrand. Robert Marcadier, a former Labour leader in the department of Pays-de-Dôme, and Marcel Lemoyne of Châteauroux, both active communists, were sentenced to death by a military tribunal of the 13th Division. Simultaneously with them, Gustave Dutour and Emile Bunlec were sentenced to hard labour for life, Lucien Chatelain to 15 years hard labour, Jean Doucheron and Roland Dennis to 10 years, Jean Bressa to 15 years, Gaby Goudou, Raoul Roland, Louis Bethau to 5 years in prison, Raoul Buffetot and Henri Ducour to 3 years, Pericles Molin to 2 years, Isairy Picard and France Requillard to 1 year in prison. The movie about the resistance in Clermont-Ferrand has many positive qualities, but it is silent on the 2 death sentences handed down by the military tribunal, and most inexcusably, nowhere or nothing is said about the protest movement sparked by the 2 death sentences against Marcadier and Lemoyne. All over the Southern Zone, and especially in the Michelin factories and in the department of Pays-de-Dôme, there were short-lived strikes. Such unrest broke out that the death penalty for Robert Marcadier and Marcel Lemoyne had to be commuted by the authorities to hard labour for life. Pétain took revenge for this defeat. On his orders, the extraordinary court in Paris sentenced 4 communists to death on September 23. Jean Catel, a member of the Central Committee of the FCP, arrested on May 13, 1941, Jacques Vogue, Adolphe Guyot, and Focadi Fresco. The next day they were guillotined in Santé prison. Jacques Vogue did not allow himself to be bound before execution, but the executioner responded, "This is the precept. It is a precept fit for executioners, not for us." Vogue shouted loudly. Martin, the executioner's handmaiden, told the following after the execution: "I can testify that they walked to the place of execution with a firm, quick step, unaided, and then threw themselves directly under the knife of the guillotine, exclaiming, 'Long live France.'" Jean Catelot is one of the founders of the communist organization in Amiens, which at first numbered only 7 people. He was persecuted by the administration for his active work in the trade unions. From July 1940, together with Jacques Duclos and Benoit Franchon, he re-established the links of the underground Communist Party and held a leading position on its board until his arrest. Before his execution, he wrote a final letter to the railroad workers and all the workers of Amiens. Workers, railroad workers, all those who have known me and have always trusted me, I urge you to continue your noble work. I love you all very much, my brothers in labour. I wish you good luck, happiness in a more humane society. Unite in the struggle, and you will be stronger. Be brothers. I will die for a just and humane cause, the most beautiful of all, for France, and whatever happens, victory will come. The first Christians suffered too, but they won. The slaves broke their chains. So will it be with the French people. Despite the terror, The activity of speeches in Paris was increasing. On September 18, 1941, General von Stulpnagel issued a statement in which he officially acknowledged that our struggle was having an effect. In recent weeks, there have been several attempts on the lives of members of the German army. In all cases, the assassins managed to escape. The population has not adequately supported the searches being conducted to identify and apprehend the perpetrators. The Nazi military command decided to impose a curfew in Paris and its suburbs from 9 o'clock in the evening. Restaurants, theatres and cinemas were to cease operations at 8 o'clock. Our struggle did not weaken. Despite the fact that all the forces and means of the Nazi suppression apparatus, and especially those of the police prefecture, were thrown against us, the occupiers and the Vicyists achieved nothing. At the beginning of October, Fernand Zalkinov, commander of the XI district detachment, was wounded. He had been assigned, together with Asher Semalilat, to organize the arson of 2 German forage warehouses in Juilly-le-Châtel, but Asher, who was working in Cray, was unable to reach him in time. Ferian decided to carry out the operation himself. He managed to set fire to the warehouses, but the French gendarmes suddenly arrived, chased him, opened fire and wounded him. And yet Fernand escaped from the chase, and the next day our Dr. Razineur gave him medical help. On the night of October 10, André Biver, Camille Drouveau, and Jean Garot cut the military telephone cable almost opposite my apartment on Rue Verres. I later learned how this operation was carried out. André first lived on Rue Rosier in Saint-Ouen with Arthur Greenberg. Since it was dangerous for the two of them to live in the same apartment, he rented a room on Rue Raphael, that is, about 50 meters away from me. One evening, on his way back to his apartment, he found a German telephone cable and decided that it was a good place to carry out a sabotage. In spite of the danger of being raided, I found it possible not to change my apartment in the aristocratic quarter. That afternoon, on arriving at a small working restaurant in the Rue Pierre-Guérin, where I occasionally ate, I saw that all the customers were in a cheerful and upbeat mood, and my usher said to me, smiling broadly, "Are you in the know? Go over there and take a look, it's all charred." She was referring to the aftermath of the attack that André and his comrade had carried out on a large German motor depot in the ex-5th arrondissement. The explosion destroyed the garage building and the cars and trucks inside were burned.